There I am. Thank you very much. I'm wearing a Choctaw hat with our Choctaw symbol on it, and behind me is our flag. We're the third largest American Indian nation in the United States. And just briefly, we are nations, and we elect our leaders. And Choctaws have been actually electing their leaders since long before that fella landed in 1490 something and didn't discover anything because we were already here. But the power of women in voting for Choctaws up until the time when the Hullos, which is the Choctaw term meaning white people, up until the time when the Hullos arrived, the only people who could vote to elect like tribal councils for the city and then state officials and then national chief, the only people that could vote were the women, were women. Men were not allowed to vote. And even to this day, although our tribal council has usually a few women on it, and the chief is Chief Gary Batten, a man, the Choctaws know that you show great respect and work for the laws the women wish to pass if you want to stay in office. We are very much a maternal culture. And when I was growing up, we would always go to Minnie Ochitama Good. She was my Choctaw grandmother. On weekends, we would all go there. All of our cousins and aunts, uncles, mothers, fathers, we would all gather and we would have a big dinner either on Saturday or sometimes after church on Sunday. But the highlight of it, for especially the kids, from the time we were little, on a stump in the backyard of Mama's house in what's now Pasadena, Texas, on Strawberry Road, tree stump was there, and my Uncle Kenneth would sit on that tree stump, and with all the kids around him, he would tell us stories. And that's how we knew about the Choctaw culture. That's how I first learned to sing Amazing Grace in Choctaw. That is now our national anthem. And we are, by Constitution, a Christian nation. And we have been Christian long before the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Missionaries from the Methodist Church came down with one primary instruction: to learn the Choctaw language. And they showed us so much respect. They worked with elders to create a written language. Before Christianity came to the Choctaw Nation, then in Mississippi, there was no written language. And only a few years later, the first book was published in the Choctaw language. It was a Christian hymn book. And on page 48 of that book, published back, oh, almost 2 centuries ago, on page 48 was Amazing Grace in Choctaw. And every hymn book that's been published, dozens since that time, dropping a few hymns, adding a few hymns, changing the page numbers, always on page 48 is that hymn, Shalom B'Sholi Topama, Amazing Grace in Choctaw. We are a Christian nation, and we are taught from the time when we are little to respect the people around you and the animals around you. One story, my grandmother used to call my father funny man, she would say. She would open the door and stick her head out, funny man, where's funny man? And my father was the only one of all his brothers that could never tell a joke. He was never funny. And I always thought, why does she call him funny man? And then when I got to University of Oklahoma and my foreign language, and this is rather ironic, my foreign language at the University of Oklahoma was Choctaw. And most people that live in Oklahoma today do not know that when they say Oklahoma, they're speaking Choctaw. Oklahoma is the word for land, and Homa is the land for red, the land of the red people. Oklahoma. Most Oklahomans don't know that. Shh, let's keep it quiet. Okay. And when you say Mississippi, everyone say that with me. Here we go. Mississippi. Now I need to see all your lips move. Here we go. Say it one more time. Mississippi. You're speaking Choctaw. The old home. That's what Mississippi means in the Choctaw language. The old home. and we were driven away. My great grandfather, John Carnes, had his home burned down when he was 10 years old. And Kenneth would tell us details about that home burning. And halfway through the Trail of Tears, a man named Andrew Jackson had it passed through Congress money for blankets infected with smallpox. They were passed out to Choctaws, and so many died. So many died. They were freezing cold. It was wintertime, and they were given blankets deliberately infected with smallpox. This is true. John Carnes, my kinfolk that did survive, he carried the bones of his mother all the way to the new home in what's now Oklahoma, and she was buried there. But Chief Pushmataha, who's probably the most famous Choctaw chief who ever lived, Chief Pushmataha, he fought with the Americans in the War of 1812, and he said something which has stayed with us forever. You can never blame the people in front of you for mistakes their ancestors made. Never blame the people in front of you for mistakes their ancestors made. It's a very forgiving concept, and it's so true. It's so true. And when I went to University of Oklahoma to study Choctaw as my foreign language, I learned that F-U-N-I, funny, is the Choctaw word for squirrel. My grandmother wasn't saying my father was a hilarious, funny man. She was calling him Squirrel Man because my father could actually talk to squirrels. He had a way about him. He could talk to squirrels, and the squirrels would talk back to him. It was so hilarious to go hunting with my father and hear him talk to squirrels. And usually around the supper table, my father would leave. We didn't have anything cooked. We would have corn, of course. I'll tell about that in a moment. But he would go out and he would bring back squirrels, and we would skin and cook the squirrels. And I asked my Uncle Kenneth one time, I said, how can he get the squirrels? I don't hear him shooting or anything. How does he get the squirrels? And he said, your funny man dad leans up against the tree and talks to the squirrels, and they come down, he grabs them, and that's how we end up cooking the squirrels. I thought, whoa, I guess I need to be careful when dad talks to me then. I never know what's going to happen. My father was a hard-working man, he was. And my Uncle Kenneth told us wonderful stories about John Carnes, and once he told us the story. In the days of long ago, there was a drought in Choctaw country. There was a terrible drought, and even the deer in the woods, they went off looking for greener places. And the gardens in the backyards of the Choctaw homes, their juicy ripe tomatoes and their leafy greens and beans, they all withered and died. And there were no squirrels, even though the young boys, Mushala and Apaka were the young boys, they would go out with their blow dart guns, but even the squirrels were gone. And what had been a river was now just a tiny trickling stream that gradually dried up. And Mashallah and Apaka, they would go out and pick berries and eat some and bring them back and share them with their friends and neighbors in town. But finally, the stream totally dried up, and they would walk for miles sometimes, and finally found some berries and maybe some little strawberries and blackberries, and would eat a few and bring them back. But they grew hungrier and hungrier, and there was no water. And one day they walked for miles and miles and miles farther than ever. And there was nothing, and they climbed atop a small hill. And they were so exhausted they fell asleep. And when they woke up, there was fog everywhere around them. And they sat up, and then the fog vanished, and standing right before them was an old woman. She was an old woman, and then she was gone. And then they could see the moonlight, and flying in front of the moon, they saw a hawk. They picked up their blow dart guns, and neither one knows which one hit it, but the hawk fell, and they feathered it and built a small fire and began to cook the hawk for the first time in days. They had something to eat. And then the fog came again. And then it disappeared. And there stood the old woman on the other side of the fire. And she said, I'm very, very hungry. And she bowed, and they picked the hawk up with leaves so it wouldn't burn and said, here, you could share this with us, and handed her the hawk, expecting her to pick a leg of it and eat and hand it back. But she looked at them and she ate every single bite of the hawk. And they looked at each other and she said, thank you, Yakoke. And Apaka and Mashallah looked at each other and they said, you're very welcome. You're welcome. Neither of them complained about her eating the only food they had seen in so long. And she turned to go, but then she turned back and she had a different look on her face. And she said, your gift will never be forgotten. Come back to this very spot in exactly 1 month. So many moons, she said, and there will be a gift here for you. Now go to sleep. And they fell back asleep and she was gone. And when they woke up in the morning, they heard something and they ran down from the hill and there was a tiny little trickle of water, and they got their hands and drank, and there were berries there and they picked the berries. And on the way home, the trickling little stream, it never grew, but it was at least some water, and there were berries along the way. And the people in town, they began to eat the berries and drink the water. And for a month, there was barely enough for the people to survive. The water never grew so much, but there was just enough, and just enough berries. And Apaka said, the lady who brought us the gift, and they looked at each other, the old people in town, the people looked at each other and said, what gift? She brought us the berries and the water. There's no woman bringing us berries. The water's coming back. And they said, no, no. She said, in 1 month, if we show up at the same small hill, she will have a gift for us. And Apaka said, I know it will be food. And Shola said, who would like to come with us? And the people laughed and made fun of them. And finally, Mashola's uncle said, these two young men are not foolish. They are very brave, and I will go with them. And who would like to go with me? And soon there were dozens of Choctaws, and they followed the young boys up. And it was miles and miles, and they came to the top of the hill, and there they saw growing something they had never seen before. It was a thick stalk, and it had arms that seemed to be hanging from the stalk, wrapped in scratchy looking leaves with something like bristling brown hair poking out one end. And the men said, oh, you call this food? And the men grabbed it and bit into it and tossed it aside and said, this is not food. I'm not eating this. But the women picked up what the men had tossed aside, and they peeled the scratchy leaves away, and they tugged away what looked like bristly brown hair. And then one of the women said, Mashola, you and Apaka go down. In my house, I have a big pot. Fill it with water and bring it. Hurry. And they ran down and soon showed up at the top of the hill with a water-filled pot. And by then, some of the men had built a fire. They tossed those limbs, those golden-colored limbs, and they boiled until finally they scooped them out and picked them up. And the woman who owned the pot held it up and said, it's here. We shall call it tonchi, corn. And the old woman, gratefulness for the hawk and the generosity of the young boys, gave the Choctaws the gift of tonchi, the gift of corn. And for Choctaws today, we live very quietly two lives. We live the life of our tradition in which we know, and then we live the regular life of 21st century, living as best we can in the COVID. But when any of us hear Amazing Grace, we know that's a sacred song to us. And at every meal, every birthday gathering, every Christmas gathering, every special meal, every Thanksgiving, and most family meals, there will be some version of corn. It is our sacred food. we have called pashofa, and it's a corn stew. It's delicious, thick stew, sometimes served with pieces of chicken. We have a special corn bread. We have banaha, which is a thinner bread made with corn and sweetened with honey. And we have just regular corn on the cob. And this is what I mean when I say we live quietly two lives. If you're eating with Choctaws and someone says, "Oh, this is delicious corn on the cob. I haven't had that in a long time." All the Choctaws will kind of look at each other and smile and nod. They know the story, the sacredness of the gift based on the generosity. For Choctaws, our vision for years and years, and now it's stated even by the chief, we live out the Choctaw spirit of faith, family, and culture. And that spirit of faith is a spirit of giving, giving, never with pride, always with humility. And so it is with humility. I thank you